Hello class and welcome to week 9 of CLS 100. This week we look at a topic that's particularly important to me because it was my college major, communication. Why would we study communication in this course? Think about what life would be like without it. Virtually every aspect of social life on Earth is essentially driven by communication. It's the building block of our relationships, it's a career success key. In fact, if you look at job postings and you talk to people who are doing hiring, written and oral skills are among the most desired qualities in job seekers. So over the course of this mini lecture and this week of learning, we will explore what's involved in the communication process, the roles of communication in your life. We'll talk about nonverbals, we'll talk about verbals, we'll talk about self-disclosure, diversity, and we'll also talk a little bit about conflict. So to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about the communication process. So if you look at this diagram, which is from your textbook, it shows the different pieces of the communication process. This model is actually called the Shannon and Weaver model because it was developed in the 1950s by two researchers named Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver. And what this shows is simply the elements of the communication process. So in communication, especially interpersonal communication, which we'll talk about next, you have a source, which is where the communication is coming from, that's sending some sort of message, which is what's being communicated, through some sort of channel, which will be how it's communicated, to a receiver, which is the person who receives the communication. And then you also have what we would call a feedback loop, where the receiver is sending messages back to the source or the sender. And the reason why this is important to understand is because there are several elements in the process and there can be breakdowns in any one of those areas. So communication is actually relatively complex. If you look at communication, one of the things that is important to understand is that there are multiple kinds of communication. And the one type of communication that we'll be looking at in this class is interpersonal communication. So interpersonal communication is a dynamic form of communication between two or more people. Now, generally, interpersonal communication will involve two people. It includes both verbal and nonverbal elements, and it can be face-to-face or mediated by technology. If you look at the spectrum of types of communication, we have intrapersonal communication, which is communication with yourself, which we're talking about here, small group, which would be communication in a group of 3 to 12 people, and then public communication, which would be communication where one speaker is speaking to a group of more than 12 people. And so with interpersonal messages, there's something that's really important to know about it, and that is that meaning in interpersonal messages happens at a couple different levels. The first level is the content level. The content level involves what is actually said. The relational level involves what is implied about the relationship in the messages. And the reason why that's important is because much of the relational meaning in messages is exchanged through nonverbals. So the relational level is often through the nonverbals, where there's more ambiguity and there's a high possibility of misunderstanding. And the problem is we often will focus on the content level of communication when the problems that we're dealing with really are occurring at the relational level. So make sure that you know which level your issues are occurring at. So why is interpersonal communication so important? I had mentioned one thing earlier, which is sort of the second major bullet on here, which is the idea that virtually every element of social life is built and maintained through communication. But to go beyond that, there's a particular research finding known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis basically says that language or communication that we know, hear, and speak actually determines our interpretation and understanding of the world. In other words, your individual reality and how you experience your world is shaped through communication. And they give an example in the textbook of a boy who was cut off from interaction with humans for a good chunk of his life, and he had no sense of self-concept or self without communication. So this idea that communication has the power to shape our actual reality would suggest that interpersonal communication is one of the most important things that we can look at. If we break down communication and interpersonal communication, there are two kind of pieces of interpersonal communication. There's a verbal aspect and there's a nonverbal aspect. Just to be clear, the verbal aspect contains only the words that are spoken. The nonverbal aspect includes everything else. So up to 80% of the meaning in messages is exchanged through nonverbals. A couple other points about nonverbals that are important is that nonverbals play the most significant role in relationship building and maintenance. And nonverbal meanings are much more ambiguous and variable. So what that means is it's really important for us to understand nonverbals because they have a significant impact on our relationships, and they oftentimes have a high possibility and high potential for misunderstanding. So if we want to understand nonverbals, we need to understand a little bit about what kinds of behavior would count as nonverbal behavior. So there are several different categories of nonverbal behavior, and I've listed several of them here. The first is facial communication, which would be your facial expressions. And actually a subcategory of that would be eye contact or eye aversion. Some of the others include vocalics. Vocalics includes what we call paralinguistic cues. So your pitch, your rate, your volume of speech are all vocalics. Now that's an important point because when we think of verbal communication is the words, but the way you say those words, how quickly, how loud, the pitch variations, all of that is nonverbal. The next category would be proxemics, which is how you use space and distance, haptics, which involves touch, olfactics, which involves scent, chronemics, which involves use of time, and that's actually an interesting one because often we don't think of our use of time as nonverbal communication. But if you're chronically late, that does communicate something to people. And finally, kinesics, which would be body movement. And when you look at nonverbals and think about the ambiguity, think of just a single behavior and how many ways it could be interpreted. So for example, lack of eye contact. If I see lack of eye contact in someone I'm talking to, I might assume it means they're lying to me. I might think that it means they're not interested in what I'm saying. And either one of those could be true. It also could be that they're not looking me in the eye as a sign of respect. And in some cultures, that's something that's pretty common. So the point is, don't assume that you know what a nonverbal behavior means. There's a lot of ambiguity, and if you have questions in an interaction, ask someone. If we look at which nonverbals are most important, that's a little bit of a loaded question, but just kind of thinking of it in general terms, oftentimes eye contact and physical space are two of them that affect most conversations. I've done exercises with students in classes before where I've had them track their nonverbal behaviors over a couple of days and report on which ones seem to have the biggest impact on communication. And eye contact is one that they frequently will bring up, as well as space. If you're in someone's intimate space, for example, that's very sort of distracting to them, whereas if you're really far away, it can also be distracting. And so in your book, just to kind of mention something they talk about in there, there's information on the use of space through what we would call Hall's proxemic zones, because the researcher that looked at these, his name was Hall. And so what it basically says is that we use different kind of areas around us. If you think of you in the center of a giant series of kind of circles, that we use that in different ways. And so your intimate space, which is between 0 and 18 inches, is a space that you rarely let other people into except for your closest friends and family. Your personal space, 2 to 4 feet, is kind of the space where you let most of your friends in. Social space, which is 4 to 12 feet, is where a lot of small group communication and sort of business transactions occur. And then 12 feet and over would be what we would call public space. And I do want to mention one other thing about nonverbals. Things like touch and scent are nonverbals that may be present in fewer interactions, but when they do occur, they can have significant impact. So it's important to think of nonverbals not just in terms of which ones are present in an interaction, but how much kind of weight they have. So inappropriate touch or uncomfortable touch may not happen in a lot of interactions, but when it does happen, it can have a significant impact on the effectiveness of communication. Okay, now moving on past nonverbals, I want to talk just briefly about computer-mediated communication, or what we would call CMC. And just to reiterate, CMC is a subcategory of interpersonal communication. And it includes things like texting, emailing, social media such as IMs, tweets, posts to Instagram, Facebook, things like that, especially when they're sent to a specific person, would be mediated interpersonal communication. And one thing just to keep in mind about mediated interpersonal communication is that mediated messages oftentimes contain greater ambiguity and potential for misunderstanding, primarily because of reduced availability of what we call social context cues. So if I am IMing you back and forth, I can't see your facial expressions. I don't know what else you're doing. I can't see your nonverbals. I don't have as much information to go off of when I'm trying to interpret what you're saying, which means that my odds of misinterpreting what you're saying tend to be higher. And with CMC, it's important to note that it can both hinder and build relationships. I actually did a research study, since my discipline's communication, and I've done some research on computer-mediated communication, and I actually did a study a couple years ago with a couple of my colleagues where we looked at the role of Facebook in interpersonal relationships, specifically college student dating relationships. And one of the interesting things that we found was that every single person in our study, except one, had a Facebook account, and they used them for all sorts of things in their relationships. But virtually all of them said that they felt like it was negative. One person even described it as a relationship ruiner. So people were pulling all this information about potential dating partners from Facebook, but were also admitting that social media oftentimes will be used and manipulated by former romantic partners, enemies, and things like that to create uncertainty in relationships. So it's interesting that people become really reliant on those sorts of technologies, but at the same time, it can have very negative impacts on relationships. So, we talked about nonverbals, and I want to briefly talk about verbal communication. And when we're looking at interpersonal communication and relationships, the primary element of that's verbal that we would look at is self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is simply sharing things about yourself. And sort of the big question related to interpersonal communication will be, how much are you willing to share about yourself? And personal disclosure is the first step. If you look in your textbook, they break down levels of kind of information into insignificant facts, informational facts, and highly significant facts. There's a theory that we look at in the field of communication known as social penetration theory, which oftentimes is talked about in terms of the onion model. The onion model basically says that if you look at all the information about a person, that oftentimes it's sort of like an onion. So there's a lot of really surface level information that's sort of easy to peel off. And then the really core information about you is much more dense, it's buried, and not a lot of people get access to that. And what we know from research is that self-disclosure is the primary verbal behavior that's associated with relationship development. So relationships develop primarily through nonverbals and through self-disclosure. Okay, the last two topics that we'll look at in this chapter are diversity and conflict. So with communication and diversity, the primary thing that I want you to take away from this chapter is that culture and differences between people always impact communication. And so you need to be aware of them in your interactions with people. And there are two particular kind of poor behaviors that are discussed in your textbook. And those mistakes are ethnocentrism, which is a belief that one's own ethnic background is superior, and a tendency to fear or judge others or groups, and xenocentrism, which is a belief that other cultures are superior to one's own and that one's own culture has little value. And when you see these being present, they tend to hinder effective communication. They become sort of a biased lens through which we filter everything. And what I would encourage you to remember as you interact with people who might be different from you in various ways is that our similarities as humans will always outweigh our differences as members of different groups. We often focus on differences, but if we can just focus on our similarities, it's so much easier to find common ground. Diversity enriches communication, it enriches relationships, and it enriches team effectiveness. So we should embrace it instead of pushing back against it. Finally, we'll briefly talk about conflict. A couple facts about conflict, and some of these might be things that you didn't know. And the first one is that conflict is inevitable in relationships and interactions. The fact is we all have different perspectives, we all have different needs, we all have different goals, and sometimes those will be incompatible with each other. If you have two people that have any level of interdependence, so people that are dating, friends, family, oftentimes the things you do affect them and what they do affects you. Anytime that condition is present, you are going to have conflict. It's inevitable. The second thing will be that conflict avoidance is generally unhelpful. That's not to say that there aren't situations where it's a useful temporary strategy, but if you run from conflict all the time, it tends to not be good. The third point would be that not all conflict can be resolved. I think that that's a common myth. We have this idea that we can always resolve conflicts. The fact is, there are some times when there is no win-win situation. And so I prefer to think of conflict in terms of managing it rather than resolving it. Fourth, conflict can lead to more productive teams and stronger relationships if managed effectively. It's not always negative. In fact, some of the best teams are the ones that engage in conflict with one another because that means that additional ideas are getting thrown out on the table. And finally, you need to search for creative win-win solutions, not win-lose or lose-lose solutions. And I do want to mention that compromise is something you should only do when necessary. Collaboration is always preferable. So what does that mean? Because you've probably heard that compromise is a good thing. When we think of compromise, what we're typically thinking of in terms of conflict is a situation where each side gives up part of what they want in order to come to some sort of an agreement. So oftentimes what happens in compromise is people think inside of the box and they only look at things related to solutions that have already been thrown out. They don't think outside the box to come up with solutions that could potentially make everyone happy. So if you can come up with those collaborative win-wins, that's always better than compromise. In a compromise where each of us gives something up, nobody ever ends up completely happy, although it can be better than some of the alternatives. Conflict oftentimes involves dealing with difficult people, and I'm just going to basically just kind of gloss over this point, but in your book, one of the things they talk about is that you need to develop strategies to deal with a variety of different kinds of difficult people. And so some of the things they mention are gossip, manipulation, showing off, goofing off, standby, complaining, and doom and gloom. And again, just kind of think about, you're going to encounter people like that. And so you need to be ready when you do. Finally, a few basic management tips for conflict. First of all, check yourself. Make sure that you're not becoming the difficult person in a situation. Don't take things personally. Try to keep things at the level of issues, not personal attacks. Third, ask questions and communicate needs. Fourth, avoid physical and verbal confrontation. Try to stay focused on issues and problem solving. Walk away to safety if necessary, and it could even be not just safety, but just taking a break from the discussion to cool down and get emotions kind of off the table. And finally, whenever you're dealing with conflict, always ask yourself, if this were the last thing I did on earth, would I be proud of the actions I'm taking? Okay, so to wrap up, strengthen your interpersonal communication skills, use CMC along with face-to-face communication, turn off technology sometimes because it's not always helpful, develop a positive sense of self, let people into your life through self-disclosure, develop diverse relationships, maintain close friendships, and learn to manage conflict. That's it for week 9. Next week will be our last week of the semester, week 10, in which we'll talk about financial literacy.